Hello, and welcome to Continuing Education, a podcast for homeschooling families with actually useful information. I'm Heidi, and today we're going to be doing a news and research roundup. That's where we take the latest homeschooling news as well as some of the latest education research that's been released and kind of determine how that can apply to us as homeschoolers. And if you're homeschooling and you're trying to stay informed without drowning in the headlines and you just want to kind of know what the conversation is around homeschooling, this is for you. So first we're going to talk about the news, then we'll talk about the research. All right, let's get into it. First up is West Virginia. In Charleston, the state Senate has been debating Senate Bill 966. It's a measure that would roll back several existing requirements on homeschool and other non-public instruction. Now, this is not unusual. We're seeing a lot of states wanting to roll back some of the requirements that they have. This bill was read for the first time this week and survived a motion to kill it on the floor, which means that it's going to go ahead and move on to further debate and potential amendments within the state. As written, SB 966 would remove requirements that homeschool parents hold certain certifications and that their curricula mirror the specific subject lists used in public schools. Annual academic assessments would still be required, but when families choose a portfolio review by a certified teacher, that review would only need to cover progress in the core areas that the parents select. So the parents would reading, language, math, science, and social studies, rather than a fixed state-mandated list. The bill would not apply to families using the state's Hope Scholarship Program, which does have its own rules and would still need to abide by those rules. Supporters in the Senate have described this as a freedom bill that recognizes parents as ultimately responsible for their children's education. Opponents, including some Republicans, have raised concerns about removing the guardrails in a state that already struggles with educational outcomes and about the possibility of unqualified adults overseeing instruction. What this could mean for homeschooling families in West Virginia is, if passed, homeschoolers would gain more flexibility in what they teach and who can legally instruct their children, though they would still need to show evidence of academic progress through assessments. Families in other states may want to watch this as kind of a broader national trend towards deregulation in their legislators and the rising debate over how much oversight is appropriate. Next to Wyoming, where lawmakers are moving to expand access to public school activities for homeschoolers. Here in Texas, we're familiar with the Tim Tebow bill. They're debating this in Wyoming. So the Senate Education Committee, they voted 4-0 to advance House Bill 23, often described as part of the broader wave of Tim Tebow laws that allow homeschool students to join public school extracurriculars. Originally, Wyoming's law applied only to grades 6 through 12, but amendment this week removed that limit, which opened the door for homeschoolers in all K through 12 grades to participate in those activities in public schools, so from sports to music and club. Under the bill, districts that charge activity fees must treat homeschool and enrolled students the same. Everyone pays the same rate if there is a fee. Administrators who testified noted that more homeschool families are asking to join school-based programs and suggested allowing districts to count participating homeschoolers for activities funding as a way to support those activities. For homeschool families, this impact is pretty straightforward. If this measure becomes law, Wyoming parents could keep full control over their academics at home while gaining a clearer statewide access to school-sponsored activities for younger kids as well as their teens. For families elsewhere, it's an example of states formalizing some access rules which can reduce case-by-case battles at the district level. Just for a little insight of how this played out in Texas, we passed a similar law, except in Texas, districts could opt into. So there are lots of districts who say, hey, we're not going to deal with homeschoolers at all. And so you might be a little bit more pressed to find a district who will accept your homeschool student if they want to do something like football or another extracurricular activity. So it will be interesting to see how Wyoming plays out and how that lands for their state. Up in New Hampshire, lawmakers are debating a bill that would dramatically reduce paperwork and oversight for home education. The proposal, dubbed the Home Education Freedom Act, would remove key requirements currently in place. Families would no longer have to notify a school district, public school, or the State Department of Education when they begin a homeschool program, unless they plan to keep using public school resources. The bill also eliminates existing rules that families keep portfolios of student work, arrange for annual academic evaluations, or submit documentation to the state when a homeschooled student finishes high school. Supporters argue this would transform New Hampshire into one of the very least regulated states for homeschooling and shift the default assumption towards trusting parents rather than presuming bad faith. Longtime advocates describe it as a paradigm shift, but some members of the homeschool community and other observers have obviously raised concerns. They worry about losing documentation that can help defend families in cases of alleged educational neglect, and about making it nearly impossible for the state to track how many children are homeschooled and how those kids are doing. For homeschoolers in New Hampshire, this debate is about trade-offs. You're going to gain some greater freedom and less administrative burden on one side, versus the less formal evidence of learning and maybe some fewer institutional protections on the other side. Nationally, it's one of the clearest examples of a state actively considering moving from moderate regulation to almost none at all. Finally, to the broader conversation about oversight, in Arizona, public radio station KJAZ devoted a recent episode of its program, The Show, to homeschooling growth and oversight. The segment highlighted that homeschooling is increasing both in Arizona and nationally, and explored concerns that this growth has not been matched by consistent safeguards to ensure that children are learning and are safe. They had a few guests. One of the guests that they had was someone named Tess Ulrey. She's the executive director of the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. She was homeschooled herself, but now she advocates for baseline oversight measures. While the program focused on Arizona, the issues discussed, basically what level of state involvement is appropriate and how to protect our vulnerable kids without overburdening families, are showing up in debates like those in West Virginia and New Hampshire and across the nation. So an interesting one to keep your eye on. For homeschool families, this is less specific about the Arizona bill or a specific bill, and more about understanding how the public conversation is shifting. Awareness of these narratives can help us as parents to communicate clearly about what homeschool actually looks like and engage constructively when lawmakers in our state or when media in our area are raising concerns. Keeping an eye on these kinds of things can allow us to reach out to our lawmakers and advocate and share our thoughts and concerns for homeschool regulation. Now let's turn to a little bit of science. We're going to talk about some of the research that's been released. A 2025 study was recently released it was basically a primary school setting where they looked at how retrieval practice compares with simple rereading when students are learning something that's complex material and they're not understanding it, such as like history or science. Researchers worked with fifth graders and compared two strategies. There was one group that repeatedly reread the material, while the other used a testing procedure, basically answering questions about the content, receiving feedback, and continuing until they achieved correct answers. Across phases of the study, the testing approach consistently produced better learning and retention than rereading alone. A secondary part of the research tried to vary how far apart study sessions were spaced, and in this particular design, changing the spacing interval by a few days did not add much benefit on top of the already powerful retrieval practice. So what this means for you at home when you're homeschooling, when your child is learning content-heavy subjects like history or science, it's more effective to have them actively recall information than to just read the chapter again or watch the video again. So a couple of examples of how you might do that. You might have them close the book and then have them tell you what they remember, then check and fill gaps for things that they might forget. You also might use low pressure quizzes, flashcards, or oral questions with immediate feedback. And you'll want to build in short, repeated retrieval over several days rather than one long cram session. In short, quizzing your kids as a learning tool and not kind of a high-stakes test can significantly improve their understanding and long-term memory. Another study that was released recently, a brand new randomized controlled trial published in 2026, examined project-based learning in middle school financial literacy unit. Researchers randomly assigned two sixth-grade classes to different types of instruction over 3 40-minute lessons. One group experienced project-based learning. Students collaboratively designed a realistic class trip budget, making decisions about trade-offs and costs, and the comparison group received more traditional, standards-based instruction with lectures and practice questions. At the end, students completed a 12-item post-test that included both multiple choice and open-ended questions about vocabulary and applied reasoning. The project-based group scored higher overall with a moderate to large effect size, suggesting educationally meaningful gains in understanding and application of budgeting concepts. Students also reported, and I think this is very significant, higher confidence and engagement. For homeschool families, this supports a simple principle that when you want kids to really grasp those real world topics like money, civics, or science, short, well structured projects can outperform worksheets. This really leads to the concept that I think has kind of gained some ground in homeschooling about unit studies. There's a lot more unit studies out there. So some practical ideas include using unit studies, finding a topic of interest and allowing them to really dive into that with hands-on experience, or letting your kiddo plan a real or imaginary event budget with a fixed amount of money and real prices. You can have them research options, make a plan, then explain or present their decisions. Basically giving them that hands-on life experience that a lot of homeschoolers already naturally do. If you're doing that, great job. If you're not doing that, you can try doing it to see if it will work. You want to keep the project short but authentic over a few sessions over months. All right. Finally, a recent in-depth meta-analysis pulled together existing research on homeschooling's impact on learning motivation and academic achievement. The authors reviewed prior studies and found that results are not uniformly one-directional. While many studies report homeschool students performing as well as or better than their peers on standardized tests, the overall picture is mixed and heavily influenced by how the studies were designed. Obviously. The meta-analysis notes recurring methodological challenges like sampling only highly engaged families, lack of control groups, and inconsistent measures, which makes broad claims about homeschooling really difficult to make. The key takeaway here is that for families that are homeschooling, the outcomes depend less on the label of, oh, my kid is homeschooled and therefore they do better, but more about the quality of the instruction and curriculum that you're using. So the study highlights that programs using diverse, well-matched curricula and individualized attention tend to yield stronger academic results. So for homeschoolers, make sure that you choose or build curriculum that fits your child's needs, not just the trendiest option. Provide consistent, thoughtful instruction. Don't just rely entirely on your kiddo watching the video or reading the book and kind of self-teaching. And then also periodically check in with their progress with outside benchmarks just so that you can adjust before gaps widen. Alrighty, that is our news and research roundup for the week. If you found this helpful, take a minute to subscribe or follow the show so you don't miss future updates. All the articles and studies mentioned today are going to be linked in the show notes so you can read the original reporting and research for yourself. If you hear about a local homeschool story, a bill in your state, a district policy change, or a program that's working well, I'd love for you to send it our way, and we'll consider featuring it in our upcoming national roundup. And if there's a study or teaching strategy you'd like to unpack for real-life homeschool use, let us know that too. This segment is here to save you time, keep you informed, and help you homeschool with both freedom and evidence in hand. Thanks for learning, and we'll see you next time.